Whoops. Okay, folks, we're back. And when we last visited with Susan, she was working at the Reporter magazine in New York in 1962, 63. And we ended abruptly, and now she's got one more thought about the people she worked with at the Reporter, and then we're going to carry on from there. Go ahead, Susan.
Well, the people that I met who worked at the time at the New Yorker, at the Reporter, were Mario Manes, Gouverneur Paulding.
Was Gouverneur an American or?
He was American. He had the name. It's a very Dutch.
Yes.
Gouverneur and Mario Manes and Edmund Taylor wrote for them, but I didn't really. He was quite famous in the Reporter. Dad read him a lot, but I didn't really know him very well. And there's another man called Derek, the name I can't remember right now, and it's too bad because he was very funny. He kept a praying mantis plant in his office, and he fed it hamburger. And he wrote me a poem for my birthday. And somewhere in my papers, it's still there on yellow foolscap paper. And he said, La fille aux cheveux de lin.
What does that mean in English? The young son?
No, the girl with the flax.
Flaxen hair? The girl with the flaxen hair.
La fille aux cheveux de lin. I don't want to cry.
Susan, it is fine to cry. Okay, we're going to move on. You...
It's 21 today, and so it's every man for himself and for Miss Linnae.
So the girl with the flaxen hair is 21 today.
And so
it's every man for himself and
for Miss Linnae.
And for Miss Linnae. Okay. So did you enjoy hanging out with this crowd?
I love them.
What is it? Did they inspire you?
They were I don't know what you call them. They were rebels. They were unlike any
Iconoclasts?
sort of. I had never known. They were older than me. They were more sophisticated, and they accepted me.
As an equal amongst them.
Well, it's maybe.
Or you were in the club.
Sort of, but yes. And it was a wonderful poem, and I somewhere in my papers I still have it.
Well, hopefully we'll find it.
And I think in New York at that time, the drinking age was
18.
18, and I wanted him to take me out for a drink, and he looked at me and he said, "Miss Linnae, you know I can't do that." And I said, "You can do it if you want it." That was our big fight. As the office of the Reporter magazine was at 666.
Madison Avenue.
Yeah, Madison Avenue. It was the 666 building. And that's where the Reporter magazine offices were. And I can remember arguing with him, "Yes, you can take me for a drink. I'm 21 today." And he said, "No, I can't. You know, this just would not be a good thing to do."
So really, given the fact that the drinking age was 18, in New York he could have taken you 3 years earlier. His reluctance was not age, his reluctance was propriety, I imagine.
All kinds of things. I don't know. Yeah, because I guess we used to go, the people, other friends, including Richard Sennett and Michael Taylor, Edmund Taylor's son, and drink at the White Horse Tavern.
Well, when I visited you in New York City in 1963 at the age of, gosh, what would I have been, 17, you took me out
Yeah.
and
And you
plied
remember
me
that
with
guy
liquor.
on the subway? We were walking on the street and we were in the subway and the guy got down on his knee.
I remember that singing, if I recall
Right,
correctly.
right.
Okay, so 63, you get married to Charles. You spend a few months or a year or whatever.
No, it's important. In 1964, I went for a pap smear in Planned Parenthood, just and It was during the Democratic Convention, and I think
Summer of 64.
summer of '64, and they thought there was something wrong with me, and I had to immediately go into the hospital. That's when Wendy Millen, the English exchange student, had come back to visit. She was no longer an exchange student. Mother had her Hillman Minks. She was so nervous she didn't know how to get to the hospital, so I had to drive myself to the hospital. I'm not sure where. We were married already, because I was married September 7th.
Was Charles still in town?
I believe so.
Okay.
I don't know where he was. No, he was already in Rwanda, I think. He'd already gone to Rwanda. And so I had to drive myself to the hospital. I'm amazed at that I actually did. Mother was so nervous. And Wendy was sort of fluttering around, and we got to the hospital, and I watched the, I can't remember what hospital it was.
St. Barnabas, possibly?
Maybe. I watched the Democratic Convention from the hospital.
But you were given a clean bill of health?
I was.
Okay.
Everything was fine. And then because Charles had the date that we had to sail, we had the shipping date to sail to, to sail to Cannes in France. We had booked passage on the Cristoforo Colombo, and we were meant to be there because he had to start at the University of Geneva.
Right. So then you spent some time in both Geneva and Berlin.
Well, first we were in Geneva for a couple of years, and then after Geneva,
And he was a student while in Geneva?
yeah.
Did you work while you were there?
In Geneva, yeah, I worked for Brice Summers. I worked for Mercury Records.
Oh, okay.
And when we were in Geneva. And then I also worked in a plastics extrusion factory as a translator
Okay.
in eastern France. And when we lived in Geneva at a place outside Geneva called Foyer Jean Knox. John Knox was a famous Presbyterian, I guess, in Geneva. And it was a student housing place. It was a fantastic place full of all these weird students. And for some reason, I had to iron Charles' shirts all the time. He had a lot of shirts, and I ironed them. And there was a lot of foreign students, particularly Serbs. I have no idea what the Serbs were doing there. And I learned a fair amount of Serb.
At that point, would they have referred to themselves as Serbs, or would they have called themselves
they were
Yugoslavs?
They were Yugoslavs, yeah,
Okay.
they were Serbs. And that was a very interesting time in Geneva. And Charles was he was a culture maven. He felt that he had to constantly improve his cultural standing. So we had tickets to the opera, we had tickets to the Théâtre de Poche. It was a wonderful time in Geneva. There was a lot of theater going on. UNESCO, we saw a lot of stuff. I mean, I was literally dragged to the theater, the symphony, at least 4 times a week, and I liked it, but I didn't feel the need to be so filled with culture as he was. But in the end, it was a wonderful experience. And during the time, Charles' father, Shanty Aiken, Clarence was his real name, born in Portland, Oregon, worked for the Bemis Bag Company.
He was the big wheel there.
Yes, and he had friends, a man called Arthur Raikes, R-A-I-K-E-S, who had been an officer in the British colonial army in India. And at some point along the line, he met this woman called Hilda. She ended up being called Hilda Lenoir. I think they called at the time, the term was she was a half-caste. She was partially European and partially Indian.
I have what?
Half-caste.
Caste, okay.
And she had married, Kay and Arthur Raikes knew her, and Shanty Aiken knew these people, and Charles and I met both of them. They were wonderful people to us, wonderful. They lived at Numéro 10 Rue de la Taconnerie in Geneva.
Okay. So they were kind of your sponsors, so to speak?
No, they just were really nice people. They I think, particularly the woman felt we were quite rough around the edges socially. We needed some polishing up, and I think she thought I particularly needed polishing up, and so they used to invite us to dinner at their house, which was excellent food and not pretentious, but to learn how to eat with the right knives and forks and what to order at good
So it
restaurants.
was kind of your finishing school.
Yeah.
So you went from there to Berlin. What was happening in Berlin?
Well, Charles wanted to continue, wanted to get an advanced degree at the, there was a place, because he had been at the University of Geneva to do his, whatever degree it was called, like it wasn't a doctorate, but it was like a master's degree, and then he wanted to go to Berlin because he always is still, I guess, interested in languages. And so the Otto Suhr Institute in Berlin is where he wanted to study political science. It was the hotbed of the student radical movement in the 1960s. He didn't go there because of that, but it turned out to be that.
So you were there in the 63, 64 time frame. What was the status of Berlin as an entity then? Was that at the height of the Cold War?
It was the Cold War, it was still, and one of the things that we used to do, I worked to make money as a short order cook at Berlin Brigade on Klee in Berlin, which was an American base.
And that was an American Army base
Yes,
in the American sector of Berlin.
Of Berlin. And we lived on Margraf Albrechtstrasse 8 and always rented rooms in people's houses.
Was that in the American sector also?
Yeah, that was all what had been, but it was now part of it was independent Berlin. It was
West Berlin.
It was West Berlin.
Right.
And and so I was very popular. We always lived in rented apartments, and very interesting people, usually war widows who I had stories and funny stories, and they liked me because I could get Hershey bars.
At the Army PX?
Yeah, and I had PX privileges, and I got coffee and stuff like that. And they were this woman in particular, not too long ago, a couple of years ago, I'd been by the house and the address, Margraf Albrechtstrasse 8. It's right off the Kurfürstendamm, and we spent a lot of time in the Kurfürstendamm. We had very little money, and there's a very famous restaurant, still in Berlin, called Eschinger's. It's very famous for its pea soup, and you could get a huge flat plate of green pea soup with sausage and as many Brotchen, these little rolls as you wanted, and that's what we live on.
So when did you leave Berlin and to go where?
We left Berlin in 1966
To come back to New York?
to come back to the U.S.
Okay.
And because why?
New York, job? Rockefeller Foundation?
No. I ended up working for the Rockefeller, but it was not for a job. I think there was some reason that Charles may have had some reason to come back, and because I had worked with the Army in connection. I didn't work sort of for the Army. This was still when West Germany was divided into war zones, and there were probably 4 or 5 trains a day going out from Berlin into the different zones. We were in the American zone, the British zone, the French zone, and we had not a lot of stuff, but we had trunks. I could ship all this stuff by the trains going out to the port of Hamburg, and Charles ended up sailing on a ship from Hamburg to go back to the U.S. And I remember I flew Icelandic Airlines for some reason. And but in the meantime, this is a good story, so I have to tell it. I had to be on the train with the trunks so that the Army to Bremen, so that the Army would accept them because they were my trunks. And at one point,
Why did you have trunks full of stuff?
because we had stuff, we
Okay.
collected things.
You weren't smuggling or anything?
No. We had stuff. And so we're on the train, and
Going to Hamburg?
going to Hamburg, maybe coming back from Hamburg. Anyway, and it was still, East Germany. We had to go, and when you went through, if you were on this train, in East German, from the Deutsche Bundesbahn was the German West German Railroad, and then there was the Ostbahn, which was for East Germany. And they had this very elaborate ceremony of hitching and unhitching the engines to get the train to go through. And so on the way back to Hamburg, after we had actually made it and gotten the trunks in Hamburg, the train got stuck.
Stuck as in snow or?
No, it broke
Disabled?
down, broke down. And it was hilarious because there was all these Russian soldiers running around, and they couldn't get the train on. They had to unhitch the West German train from the East German engine, and the Russians were kind of in charge. And it was very embarrassing for them, and I was watching out the window and laughing.
And this was happening in East German territory?
Yes. And I thought it was very funny. And I knew enough German to know what was going on. And I think I smoked then or something. I had some Lucky Strikes, and I threw these cigarettes to these East German soldiers, and they were really thrilled to have them.
Okay, carry on.
And it was a wonderful trip. And it was through, I didn't meet them then, but when Charles went to take the ship with our possessions from Hamburg, that's where he met the wonderful family of Hartmut and Annalena Rabis and their 3 children, Sebastian and...
Are they the doctors I met in Munich?
Yes, we went out to dinner with.
Yes.
And we became fast friends, and they were wonderful people. And Charles met them on the boat.
Okay.
The little family, when Hartmut was going to study at Rockefeller University to do cancer research.
So then you and Charles reconnect back in New York City, and he gets a job eventually working for the United Nations.
First for the Foreign Policy Society.
Okay.
Foreign Policy Association on 47th and UN Plaza.
Okay.
And then he worked for the UNDP.
United Nations Development Program.
Yeah.
And his first assignment was to Rwanda?
Well, actually, his first assignment was to the Comoros, but I would not go.
And so he then renegotiated and got sent to
Somehow
Rwanda.
they came up with another job.
Okay.
To Rwanda.
Kigali, Rwanda.
Yes.
And you went there in 1968, and
1970.
what was it like there?
It was like nothing else in the world. And it actually involves another part of the story of Germany. Because I had gone to visit Hartmut and Annalena in Munich, and this was 1968 when there were all these student uprisings and everything. And
The Red Brigade type stuff?
yeah, well, no, the Red Brigade was a bit later, but it was student unrest. It was
Well, it was happening all over the world.
yes, and so I had gone to visit Hartmut and Annalena in Munich, and I had left New York because I was supposed to be flying to Rwanda, and Charles had bought 2 shotguns, a big 365. He was going to be the big game hunter, and he had guns, and I traveled on an El Al flight from New York to Brussels, carrying rifles and shotguns.
In the passenger compartment or as checked baggage?
Check baggage.
Okay.
And for some reason, I remember Germany was at the time one of the few countries that had X-ray machines, any kind of rudimentary X-ray machines, and these things got loaded on, and I wasn't really worried, but I thought it was kind of, and so the German looked and said something about, like, what is that? And I said, it's a croquet set.
And they believe you?
They didn't know what a croquet set was. I mean, and they obviously weren't very.
So this was upon arriving, you said Germans. Weren't you flying to Brussels?
No, I flew, but then I had to transfer.
Oh, okay.
And I had gone to Munich
There you go.
to visit Hartmut and Annalena
Okay.
with my shotgun and my 365 hunting rifle, and which had flown in the El Al flight
Okay.
from New York.
Well, give us a thumbnail of your life in Kigali, Rwanda, for a couple of years.
Well, I flew from trying to think where it was from. I know it would have been from Brussels to Kigali. That was it was on Sabina Airlines, and I had no idea what Rwanda was. I knew what it was, but I had no expectations, no nothing. And the plane came. Now it's this main runway in Kigali still is built on the back of this hill, because Rwanda is known as the land of 10,000 hills, as Minnesota is known as the state of 10,000 lakes. I like to go places where there are 10,000s of things, and I had no idea what Rwanda was. Maybe I'd read a little bit about it. I knew nothing, maybe gorillas or something like that. I'd never been in Africa.
You'd never been in the, quote, third world up to that point?
No.
Okay.
And I had no kind of fears or expectations or anything. And I remember when the plane, it's the Kanombe, the main landing strip is still on the backbone of this hill, and it comes down, and it was kind of like gray or something, and I looked out the window of this plane, and I saw these men, very tall, thin men, wrapped in some kind of, we call them shukas now, I know this kind of, their cloth, and they had spears, and they kind of shook the spears at the plane.
In irritation or in honor?
I don't know why. They just did it. I remember seeing it. And so then the plane kind of glided to a landing. And I don't think I've ever seen, actually there was a more spectacular landing. That's got to be another story. That's landing in Saudi Arabia. But, on the back of this hill, and seeing these guys there, and the wind from the flight, it was a 707 or something. And their shukas were waving and their spears were going, and I had imagined that they were kind of shaking their spears a little bit at the plane and getting off the plane, and it was kind of dusty. I remember it smelled the way Africa's always smelled to me, this kind of sour milk smell that I had smelled years before when I went to visit the Belgian Colonial Museum in Tervuren in Brussels, and that's the smell I always associated with Rwanda and Congo. It's this curdled milk in these carved wooden kind of bottles that people made to carry their milk around in. The smell, and I smelled it for the first time. I didn't know, and then I remembered I had been in the museum in Tervuren, and that's why I had smelled it. So I knew that I had been in the place before, even though I had never been there before.
Wow, kind of a deja vu moment.
Well, or deja smelled.
Yeah.
But it was it was a very strong thing, and for the whole time I was in Africa, that was the smell that I remember. And it was kind of a mixture of that smell, and it was often kind of damp and smoky and wet, but that was the smell.
So what was life like for you guys in Rwanda? Did you work?
Yeah.
What did you
I didn't
do?
have a proper, I had various jobs. I worked for what was the beginning of the European Development Fund. These were, I don't know, kind of made up jobs.
Temporary gigs?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Nothing dealing with journalism at that time?
no, nothing at all. And I think I found, there was a wonderful couple. When we went there to work for UNDP, there were maybe, let's say, there were probably not more than 20 people that Charles worked with in these various development projects that included teaching typing, which I thought was hilarious. But I guess it is a development skill. And there were all different nationalities. There were the Doyacheks, the Czechs who had just come after the overthrow of whatever government.
They were employees of the UNDP?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, not it's UN. They were experts. The UN had the system of experts. So I met Monsieur and Madame Cimbru, which Cimbru means time in Romanian. They were very nice. We got to visit them in Romania later on. Doyacheks, the Czech, there was a large different group, French people, Belgians, wonderful French guy, great, really interesting people. And that was my memory of the UN.
Did you have much interface with on a social level, with the Rwandan nationals?
The Rwandese. Actually, yes, because when Charles and I had first moved to New York, after being in Berlin, and Charles was involved with the UN, he joined the US UN Association, and we became kind of hosts of newly arrived African diplomats. And among some of the people that we got to know the best were a young Rwandese family.
While you were in Rwanda, that ended up being 20 some odd years, I suppose, before the Rwandan genocide. Mm-hmm. Did you have any sense then that something like that was on the horizon?
Well, that was the part of the history of Rwanda from the past. There had been a series of various wars between I don't like to talk about this because people always get it confused. If they want to know, they can look it up. But it was when we lived in Kigali, and we used to drive out from Kigali to go to, we went on picnics. There were a lot of banana groves and things like this, and there were all these roadblocks where we had to stop. And always soldiers and everything, and they were to keep the Inyenzi, they were called, which means cockroaches in Kinyarwanda, who were the Tutsis, who had the Hutus rose up to get rid of the Tutsi king and chase the Tutsis away to Uganda, and the Tutsis were not happy about this, and they planned their return, which they eventually did. And there were a lot of rivers outside Kigali, and you drive, and they were trying to keep the Inyenzi out.
These checkpoints, were these run by the recognized government?
The Rwandese army, yeah.
Okay. So even at that point in time, you thought something was amiss.
Oh, and people talked about it. We knew people. This Turkish guy, Celal Algan, the doctor who worked for WHO, a great guy, had lived through a lot of the stuff there, and he had people who worked for him. So there was always something brewing. Things had not been sorted out. It had not been solved. So we were never. We had roadblocks and things like this that we had to go through, but I don't recall ever being ever afraid, ever.
Okay. So you were in Rwanda for a couple of years, and then
we left in July 1971.
And Charles was transferred to Buenos Aires.
Yeah.
In Argentina.
First he went to Ecuador, and then.
Did you go to Ecuador with him?
No.
Was he there for just a short term,
Yeah,
or
maybe 4 or 5 months.
Oh, okay, just a temporary assignment. And then you moved as a couple to Buenos Aires, and that's where...
In January of 1970.
And 70, a minute ago you said you left Rwanda in 71.
Well...
So it would have been like 72?
No, it wasn't 72. It was closer to, anyway.
Okay, so that's where we picked up in episode 1 when you were working for IBM Latin America, and that's when the journalism stuff started. So we're going to pause now for this episode. And when we get together again, I think we'll talk about the beginning of the journalism career after Argentina. So thank you and goodbye for now.